advice, and when you see someone near me, that means they're handling me. And we are closing, as I understand it, we are closing the auction in the next 10 minutes. So just so you know that, if I think I got that right. Okay. I'm here to really talk about the highlight of the evening. Not only did these principals talk about the importance of what we're doing in schools, we've asked Leslie Weirich. She's going to be joining us. She is a Fort Wayne native. She lives in Goshen, in the Goshen area, and she has an incredible story to tell you. The thing I'm most impressed, and I'm not going to give a lot of the story away, is the thing I'm most impressed is how she is allowing God to use her experiences to affect others. So I'd ask that you just welcome Leslie to the stage, please.
Good evening. I'd like to thank Crosswinds for inviting me here this evening to share our story. It's actually one I've told many times over the past few years, but it never gets any easier. You think that it would, but it's just not how our story works. You see, our story begins with this big, strong, handsome football player. His name is Austin. He was the president of his freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior class at Goshen High School. He played football and ran track all 4 years he was there, and was also voted the scholar athlete in one or both of those sports all 4 years of high school. Austin went on to graduate in the top 3% of his class, receiving $26,000 a year in renewable academic scholarships, which allowed him to attend and play football at Wabash College in Crawfordsville, Indiana. So blessed we have our beloved Wabash here with us tonight, wherever they are. Wabash always fights. He entered college in the fall of 2014 and quickly made many friends. You see, for those of you who don't know, there are only 3 colleges left in the United States that are all male, and Wabash is proudly one of them. So those young men become like brothers, and the ones on the football team, they form a bond like no other. Now, Austin was a very good student, very driven, very focused. He worked extremely hard. He knew exactly what he wanted to major in, and he knew that it wasn't going to be easy, but he dug into the books, and he decided to major in economics and minor in business. He had plans after college to go on to graduate school in either business or possibly attend law school. He also became very involved with many programs on campus because Austin always felt like he was called to be a leader, and he really wanted to make a difference in this world. He was the president of the Independent Men's Association on campus, and this was a group that represents nearly half of the students who choose not to live in a fraternity during their college years. Austin was a very independent thinker, very independent young man, so he represented that group quite well. He was also very active in something called the War Council. Now, the War Council stands for Wabash Acts Responsibly. This is an organization on campus which leads students in making good, sound, responsible choices. They deal with issues such as alcohol on campus and mental health concerns and just helping students make really good decisions and choices when the stress of college life gets to be a little too overwhelming. Austin was actually scheduled to lead a meeting for this group on the morning of September 12th, 2016. But unfortunately, our son Austin never showed up for that meeting. He never showed up because in the early morning hours of September the 10th, 2016, everything in his life and in ours was about to take a turn. It all started about 2:30 in the morning with someone ringing our doorbell like crazy. Now that's a sound that no parent ever wants to hear, but especially at 2:30 in the morning. My husband Keith, Austin's dad, can sleep through almost anything, but not me. I'm a very light sleeper. So as soon as I heard the pounding on our front door and the ringing of the doorbell, I jumped out of bed as fast as I could, and I woke Keith up and I said, "Someone's at our front door." We quickly ran downstairs and I said through the door, "Who is it?" They answered, "Goshen Police." And at that moment, I looked through the front window to see the police car in front of our house. While my husband was still running downstairs, I opened the front door. I couldn't imagine what was going on. Our son Austin was 165 miles away at college, and our 17-year-old daughter Hannah was upstairs sleeping in her room. Why on earth would the police be at our door at 2:30 in the morning? What we were about to find out would change our lives forever. The police officer said, "Do you have a son, Austin Weirich, who attends Wabash College?" And I said, "Yes. Yes, I do." Then came the words that absolutely no parent ever wants to hear. "You need to call this number at the college because your son has been in an accident." I grabbed the card out of his hand and I ran back into the house to find my cell phone. At the time, Keith and I were both standing in the kitchen when I called the number and the dean at the college answered. He told us that there had been an accident that evening at Austin's townhouse, that Austin was with his girlfriend, and he had shot himself. He said that the ambulance was transporting him to St. Vincent's Hospital in Indianapolis, and we needed to come as quickly as possible. In that moment, I knew we were about to face the hardest night of our lives, but I also realized we had to be strong for our daughter. We went upstairs to let her know her brother had been in an accident, and we needed to get to Indianapolis as quickly as possible. We asked her to pray for Austin, and we told her we would call her to update her with more news as soon as we had it. Now, I have seen some really bad thunderstorms in my lifetime, but I have never seen rain or lightning or thunder like we drove through that night. We had a 3-hour drive ahead of us to Indianapolis, and we were only about a half hour down the road when my cell phone rang. It was the emergency room doctor from St. Vincent's. He asked if we were on our way. I told him that we were. He asked if we could pull over to the side of the road so he could talk to us. He said he was sorry to tell us that the ambulance had just arrived with Austin, and there was no pulse. I said, "What do you mean?" It's like my head and my heart could not process the words he was saying. He said, "I'm sorry to tell you that your son did not survive the accident. We still need you to come, but please be careful driving through the storm." At that moment, my husband Keith, who is about the most soft-spoken man I've ever met in my life, cried out to God. We both just sat in darkness on the side of the road and listened to the rain pounding on our windshield. Finally, we drove on in silence, except for the rain, which never let up. When we got close to the hospital, Keith looked over at me and said, "It's like God is crying with us tonight." And I believe that he was. Even though we were in total shock and grief as we pulled into the parking lot that night, we were about to experience the power of the Holy Spirit, revealed in ways and through people that to this very day, 2 years later, I can't even explain. In Isaiah 43:2, it tells us, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and when you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. We were definitely about to be carried through the rest of the night and into the morning by the love and mercy of Jesus Christ, who sent his people to us. Keith dropped me off at the front door of the emergency room while he parked the car. I ran in as fast as I could, and I told them who I was. And when I looked up, there was this man walking toward me with a hospital jacket on. He said, "Mrs. Weirich, my name is Paul, and I am the chaplain here." By that time, Keith was coming in the front door, and Chaplain Paul asked if he could take us to the lounge where he could sit down with us. If I live to be 99 years old, I will never forget this man's face, and especially his soft and gentle voice. We were only sitting down for a few minutes when the doctor and nurse, who were both men, came into the lounge to talk to us. They asked us if we'd like to see our son, and I'm not sure where these words came from, but immediately I said, no, because our son's not here anymore. Keith and I have never regretted that decision. But here's where the most amazing act of kindness and love came from that night. Because of a suicide, someone has to identify the body. Somehow, in the depths of my grief, in those early morning hours, I seem to remember that my son had a very unique football injury on his left ring finger. As I was describing it to the doctor, Chaplain Paul spoke up and asked if he could go back and identify Austin's body for us. What an incredible gift that could have only been given to us by someone who's walked in our shoes. 2 Corinthians 1:4 tells us he gives us comfort in all our trials so that we in turn may be able to comfort those with the same sort of sympathy in theirs. Before he went back to identify Austin's body for us, he asked if he could pray with us. Both the doctor and nurse knelt down, and as Chaplain Paul began to pray, he asked God to comfort us in the same way he had been given comfort just 3 years earlier when he lost his 17-year-old son. You see, that's how God works. He never wastes our hurt. So that's why I'm here tonight. That's why I'm speaking to you and sharing our story. After Austin died, I prayed to God and I asked him to show us how we could use our tragedy and Austin's life for good. So as we were planning Austin's celebration of life service, there was a scripture that just literally popped right out in front of my eyes. And I have clung to this verse for the last 2 years. Genesis 50:20 says, "You intended to harm me, but God used it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many, many lives." Before we left St. Vincent's Hospital that morning, we were able to donate both of Austin's heart valves, his corneas, and all of his bone and tissue. Many lives were restored and saved because of my son's decision to be an organ donor before we ever left that hospital. A week after he died, we established the Austin Weirich Memorial Scholarship Fund, and in the past 2 years, we have given away 2 college scholarships in his memory. And this past October, I launched the first faith-based suicide prevention and awareness program in our county. And I've had the opportunity to speak with hundreds of teenagers over the past few months, and not only give them a message of hope, but also practical tools on how to prevent suicide. So getting back to the reason I'm here tonight speaking to you, it's because I have absolutely no other choice. The night I walked across the stage with my husband Keith to award the first college scholarship in Austin's memory, God clearly spoke to me. He told me that he could continue to use Austin's life and our story to save many, many lives. Even though we would have never chosen this path, We believe in a God who can take our tragedy and use it for good. In Romans 8:28, it tells us in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. So that's why I put myself through those details that I would much, much rather forget, because this is now God's purpose for my life. I knew my son very well, and if he were here tonight, he'd be the first person to tell you what an incredibly stupid thing he did and how much he wished he could take it back. He would tell you that you never want your parents' doorbell ringing at 2:30 in the morning. He would tell you that you never, ever want to ask someone you love to have to identify your body. But he's not here tonight. So I speak for him, and I speak on behalf of Austin. And I have not come here, as you can tell, as a polished, professional public speaker, but just as a mom, as Austin's mom, to talk to you about hope. You know about hope? Did you know that a man can live 40 days without food? And we can live about 3 days without water. And we can actually even live 8 minutes without air, but only 1 second without hope. Because if you only listen to one thing I say tonight, please hear this. No one ever dies of suicide. They don't. Their circumstances may be very different. Their backgrounds may be different. What leads up to that moment may be different. But it comes down to that moment, that single moment, when they lose hope and they can't see to the next moment when things are going to get better. My son FaceTimed me for 45 minutes the day that he died. He even called his dad at 6:30 that evening to catch up with him. He was on top of the world. He talked about his classes, and he even told me all about his weekend plans. He said he was going out for burgers with the guys that night. The football team had a bye weekend, so they had plans to go watch the Notre Dame game, the home of one of his buddies, on Saturday. In fact, Austin even lifted weights and worked out at 4:30 that afternoon. I know, because I picked up his wet towels. They were still damp from the shower. Austin had absolutely no intention of taking his life that night. He panicked, and in the moment he was in, he lost hope for a split second, and he lost his life. About a week after he died, my neighbor came down to see me. She said she just couldn't even imagine how this could have happened to our family. She said if this could happen to a kid like Austin Weirich, then it can happen to anyone's kid. At the time, I was just so deep in my grief that I had no idea how true her words were going to become. On September 10th of this past year, 2018, our family marked the 2-year anniversary of Austin's death. Now, I'll be honest with you, the first year was pretty rough, and we were still numb getting through it. But this year, we wanted to remember him and celebrate his life in a meaningful way. So as Keith and I were finishing the day together, getting ready for bed, we received a text message from one of Austin's former roommates. He said, "Mrs. Weirich, I don't know if you heard, but Evan Hansen, the co-captain of the Wabash football team, took his life today. I am so sorry to have to tell you this, especially today, but I just didn't want you to hear about it on the news." Our grief, which we were still learning how to navigate through, was now compounded as we shared it with the Hansen family of Carmel, Indiana. Evan Hansen was only 21 years old and about to graduate with a double major in Spanish and biology. He had just been recognized 2 days earlier as the co-captain of the football team with his parents on Senior Saturday. He was strong and bright and incredibly kind and compassionate. Evan's life defined the term servant leadership. He had plans to go on to graduate school at Marian University and become a nurse, working in underprivileged countries. And just like my son Austin, Evan had plans to make the world a better place. But in that split second, he lost hope, and he lost his life. And most of all, the world lost another young man who had so much to offer. So my neighbor's words, they've become all too prophetic over the past couple of years. If this can happen to young men like Austin and Evan, then it can happen to anyone's son or daughter. It can happen to your grandson, or your mailman's nephew, or your hairdresser's daughter. Suicide doesn't look like Austin or Evan. It looks like everyone's kid. So that's my message tonight. It's exactly why I'm here. We know the statistics tell us that suicide is the second leading cause of death in college students, and that young men are 4 times more likely to take their life than women. I could actually stand up here all night and just quote statistics, but that's not going to change anything. What can we do to prevent these young people from taking their lives before they've even really had a chance to live? So many times over the past few years, my husband Keith and I have been asked, what could we have done differently to save our son? If we could go back and change anything, what would it be? Austin looked like he had it all. Perfect grades, scholarships, athletics, even leadership. But underneath all those achievements, we now look back and realize was depression. He just hit it very, very well in perfectionism. If we could change anything at all, we wish we would have understood that earlier in his life and how much he was struggling. We would have started counseling for our son in middle school or high school, because we now know and we fully understand how critical counseling is, especially at an early age, where it can help our kids develop their self-esteem and teach them the coping skills that they're going to need throughout their lives. So that's why I've come here tonight. Once again, I am not a public speaker. I am just a mom who believes with all my heart that early intervention counseling could have saved our son's life. And that's why I am incredibly honored to be speaking on behalf of Crosswinds this evening. Their work in these schools is saving young lives so that no other family has to hear their doorbell ring at 2:30 in the morning. Thank you for allowing us to share our story with you this evening.